Hey there and welcome back to the Code Wrinkles channel for a brand new video. In this one we'll talk once again about ASP.NET Core services, but now we will concentrate on how to inject a scope service into a singleton service or in a background worker service or in a background task. Now, in a real application or in scenarios of real life applications, we see this type of scenarios very often. And unfortunately, I have seen a lot of cases then that when developers are faced with this type of problem, they start to simply move service methods around so that everything would work fine. But then the services don't really respect or reflect the domain logic anymore, and everything kind of gets messed up. And the only thing why this happens is because, unfortunately, I see that there is a lot of unclarity about how to really achieve this thing, about how to use a scope service into a singleton service or in a background service. So in this video, we will look exactly into this type of discussion. Let's then switch back to Visual Studio, and as a starting point, we'll take a very basic API that we have already created when we talked about background services. And in that case, we have implemented this very simple weather forecast background services with an API controller that actually implements two different methods, and we'll take a look at it just in 1 second. However, before we go into this, I just want to say, if you're not familiar with hosted services or background services in ASP.NET Core, then please pause this video and go to the other where we talk in depth about what a background service is, how background services work, and which are the two main different ways in which we could implement such services, one being using the iHosted service interface, and the other being using the background service class. It is an abstract class. And then you can come back here, you can find the description, you can find the link to the other video here in the description, so please feel free to go ahead, because it's really important to understand exactly what we are talking about, since everything we'll do today will happen actually here in these background services. And the main reason why I chose this project to start on this video is because, well, background services are actually singleton services in ASP.NET Core. So that's exactly the point. How can we then inject actually a scoped service into a singleton service? But before we get going, I would like to run the application and also show you what exactly happens right now. But before we start, let's just look into this very basic service configuration. This is the iWeather forecast service, which is injected in both of the background workers, of course. And here we have properties forecasts, which randomly generates a list of 5 forecasts. And the current weather forecast, well, we take the first forecast here in that list. As said, both services kind of implement exactly or use the exact same service. Now, please take a look here before we get going, is that the current weather forecast service is scheduled to run each 5 minutes, while the forecast calculator is scheduled to run each 1 minute. So this means that this service here, this background service, runs more frequently. Now let's run the application and look into what exactly this means. And the reason why I want to do is because we can extrapolate this to all type of services that you might use in your ASP.NET Core application. And from using a singleton service, you might run into some very nasty bugs or problems, specifically because of what we will be able to witness here. So let's enlarge those 2 endpoints and let's try them out. So let's execute this one. So we see that we have here the current weather forecast here is the first one is 6. And if we run the second one, it should get exactly the same value. Because in this case, it's exactly the same value. Because in this case, we share the really same instance of the weather forecast service. So no matter in which method actually I make the call, or towards which method I make a call, I'm getting exactly the same things back, because it's a singleton service and the information stays exactly the same. So I would expect now, for instance, that in any second, if I execute this once again, this value should change here for the first entry. Right now it's still 6, but now it's 7, so it has changed. And let me show you now what the problem with the singleton service is. The problem is that if we execute this one, we see that it actually also changed here. although the current forecast background service did not run. So this is the main problem with singleton services, because if you want to kind of like have an isolation between different operations that you do in singletons or in background tasks, or even in regular requests if you use singleton services, is that, well, you share exactly the same information of the service. And for instance, in cases where you work with databases and make sure that you don't try to change the same resources at the same time, so you really want to have as much as possible your services scoped to the request, because this is actually the best way that you could isolate everything that you do between each request. So the problem is that, okay, you might say, okay, we need here a scoped service. That should be easy. Let's just go here in startup, and instead of add the weather forecast service as a singleton, let's add the service as a scoped service. And you might argue, well, that's it. Now it should work. We should be fine. Now the problem is, if we run this application, if you just wait 1 second more, or 2 seconds, or 3 seconds, voila, here it is. We get a nasty error. And if we look in this error, it says that, okay, let me make this bigger. Here it says that, okay, while validating the service, okay, and let's get a little bit more down. And here, okay, some services could not be constructed. And here it should be somewhere the message, sorry for this one. We should see here somewhere a message that says cannot consume scoped service, and then the name of the service, which is the iWeather forecast service, from singleton. So exactly the problem. We wanted to change the service in scope so that we don't share exactly the same instance. But here, as we did this change and changed the service to scoped, all our background services actually fall apart. So you might say, okay, we need a solution to that. And unfortunately, I had discussions and I've seen code written by a lot of developers that were facing exactly the same trouble. And the response is usually, okay, let's maybe take the method that we need out from the scope service and put it in the singleton service. However, this kind of violates the single responsibility principle, as the services are modeled around the domain, and you can't simply just take a service or take a method out from a certain scope service, which of course represents something about your domain, and move it in another one, which most probably represents a total different part of your domain. So it kind of doesn't make sense. Or maybe I've seen other workarounds that try to kind of create a new service specifically for a method or two methods that need to be consumed in a background service or in a singleton service. And clearly all these type of workarounds are totally wrong. This is not how we should do that. So if you want, or if you find yourself in a situation where you need to add or to inject or to consume a scoped service into a background service or a singleton service, it's actually or virtually exactly the same, then the good thing to proceed, or the good way to proceed, would be to use an IServiceProvider instead, to create your own scope and then to resolve the service that you need. So it's basically 3 steps once again. Get an IServiceProvider, and we can get it via dependency injection, of course. Then the second step, as said, is create your own scope when you need it and only for the time that you need it, and then resolve the service that you need inside that scope. And it's actually exactly what ASP.NET Core does when a request comes in. It uses an IServiceProvider to create a scope for the request, and then it resolves the services, the scope services that are needed for that specific request. So it's exactly what ASP.NET Core does. Exactly the same thing is what we should do when we face this type of scenario. And you will see this is not complicated at all. If we just know the principles, these very simple 3 steps, then you'll see everything should be very, very easy to implement. So let's try to take it step by step. The first thing is we don't want to inject this iWeather forecast service here anymore, but instead we want to inject an service provider instead. And let's also change the name of this field. Let's make it service provider. That should be fine. And we should also change this to IServiceProvider. That should be fine. Let's change also this. But I see that this is uppercase. That's not what I intended. Let's change also here in the constructor what we do. Service provider, and we want here the service provider also. Now, the first thing you might be tempted to do is actually get the service provider and create a scope and to get the service that you need, resolve the service that you need right in the constructor, and then maybe assign it to a field and use it to wherever you need it. However, in that case, what you actually do is you resolve the scope service, but you keep it also singleton. So because you'll keep it as long as this service lives, this singleton service in which we are currently. So doing all this stuff in the constructor of the singleton service, or in this case of the background service, is actually it doesn't really solve the problem. So it will most probably work, of course, but conceptually you're doing actually exactly the same thing, or almost exactly the same thing. So in this case, I would like to move towards the discussion towards the method that we actually execute here. So the idea is that if you have a service provider in a field, you should try always to keep the scope for the services as short-lived as possible in order to avoid the problems that we have talked before. So in this case, of course, the best thing to do is to go in the method where we actually need that service, create a scope there, resolve the service that we need, do the job that we need to do with that service, and then dispose it and say goodbye to it. And the next time that we need it, we do exactly the same things. We create a scope for that specific time where we need it, we resolve it, we use it, and then we dispose it. And it's actually very, very simple to do this, because we can have here a variable, let's call it scope, and that could be equals to service provider dot create scope. Now, by default create scope, we have to import a namespace, which is the Microsoft Extensions Dependency Injection. And here this creates a scope. Now, this iService scope also implements iDisposable. So this means that we can even use a using statement here and make sure that this scope is disposed right when it's not needed anymore. Now, of course, we could use here regular code blocks, but we can also take advantage of the newer C# syntax, and we can simply just go ahead and write what we need to do. Now, let's create a service, which let's call it forecast service. And in this case, as I said, we can say here scope, and here we have a get on the scope, sorry, we have the service provider, and on the service provider, we can say here get required service. And you can also place what you need in or as an argument, but this is also a generic method, and then you can use the generic, and I say that I want here a iWeather forecast service. So in this case, I have this weather forecast service. I can do the things that I want to do here. For instance, let's change it like this, and this should work right now, and let's change it like this, and this should also work right now. And yeah, I guess that's pretty much it. So once again, what we have done, when you want to inject a scope service into a singleton service or a background service, first thing you have to do, inject the IServiceProvider. Then the next thing to do, when you need to use that service, so not in the constructor, but where you need to use it, then just create a scope. From the scope, then resolve the services that you need, use the services, and then everything is done. So let's run this application again. And of course, in this case, sorry, because I haven't changed the other service, so it will probably also fail. So let's, before we run it again, of course it fails. Before we run it again, let's also go once again to the startup here. But in this case, we just want let's comment out this one. And let's just run the application. And the problem, or yeah, the idea is that I guess we still needed to implement it also in the other service, because right now that wouldn't be. So let's also implement this here in this service. So instead of this, we need an IServiceProvider. Service provider with underscore, of course. And then we need also here an IServiceProvider. You see it's very easily, it's virtually a few minutes. And if you use shortcuts in Visual Studio, it's even less. But I don't like to use shortcuts, especially for videos. I guess it's easier than to for the viewers to have a look at what really happens here. So here we have this service. Of course, here it doesn't really work that anymore, but we can simply do it as following. So var scope equals, sorry, we should put this in a using. So using var scope equals service provider dot create scope. And of course, we would have to also use here the Microsoft extensions dependency injection. Then the next thing, just resolve the service var forecast service equals scope dot service provider dot get required service, and we'll use once again the generic version of this method. And I say that I want an iWeather forecast service. And then I can do exactly the same thing, only that the variable is named differently in this case without the underscore, and that actually should do it. So once again, we have fully implemented this scope service also in another singleton service, or in this case, the background service. So the application starts. So right now I wouldn't expect any error. And once again, let's go here and let's go here. Let's try this out. And we see in this case that here we have this one as a first value. But already from this point, if we try this out, you'll see that actually this is with minus 18. So the first entry here doesn't, or is not equal, is not the same as the first entry here. And the main reason why this happens once again is that all the services are scoped to that specific method where we need it. So in this case, what happened is actually that, yeah, here actually we created a new instance, so with new random weather forecasts, and here we created another instance with new forecasts, but we have, or we take only the first one from that list. So if we run this again right now, we'll see that it actually executes. And I guess that has even changed in the meantime, or right now it changes actually every time that that I execute here a method, because every time actually I get a new instance, because this service is right now scoped also in the controller. So that's exactly the point. So right now, basically all requests to these services, and including the background tasks, are actually totally independent and isolated from one and the other, because this iWeather forecast service is now scoped. So yeah, as you have seen, that's actually it. Once again, as a summary, if you want to resolve a scoped service in a background service or a singleton service, there are 3 steps that you have to do. First, inject the IServiceProvider instead of the service that you need or the services. Then the second step, where you need that service, so exactly where you need it, just create a new scope for that specific service, also putting it in a using statement. And then the third step, resolve the service via this get required services method, where you can provide exactly what type of services you need. Then of course use the services, do what needs to be done, and then that's it. Next time that this method executes, you will create a new scope with new instances of the same services. And that's actually it. So that's what we wanted to showcase. Thank you very much for watching. I hope that this video was useful for you, that you might have learned something new from it. If you have any suggestion or feedback regarding this, then please just feel free to drop me a comment. So don't be shy, the comments are always open, and I really like listen to feedback. And also, if you really think that this video was great value, then don't be shy once again, and try to share it with your people in your network, with your peers, with everybody that you think might find this video actually useful. This being said, thank you very much for watching, and until the next time, I wish you the very best.